Hello, everybody. Good morning. It's Lance here. If you can find a spot, we'll get underway. We're running slightly behind schedule, but that's all right because we have dropped a speaker out, but we've got two fine speakers this morning, and in afternoon tea we've got a couple zooming in for various reasons. For those who weren't here yesterday, I'm going to do the housekeeping. Although one of the new people knows where the fire gathering area is, in fact, in the front car park. So, just to remind you, if you weren't here yesterday, if we can use the exit door over here, if you just want to stretch your legs and or after you get your coffee, rather than going through the cafe. But you will need to go to the cafe to the bathrooms. Or if you want to actually go to the cafe and get something, then that's fine too. But the cafe is functioning while we're in here too, so ease the traffic there as we can. If there are any issues, please see Karen down the back or myself. I think we know how the event's running. We've got two speakers this morning, 20 minutes each or so, and 5 minutes. We do have a little bit of extra time, so if we get lots of questions, we can cope with that as well. So, I think that's about it. I'll hand over to Peter, who's going to give us a rundown of yesterday and other things. Thank you, Peter.
Yes, I'm Peter Gell. I'm giving the review. I also have taken up an offer I couldn't refuse from Lance, and that's to be Max Finlayson for the morning. So I'll see what I can do to emulate Max this morning, or not. And we have a few other changes to the program, and we've brought Graham Coulson forward to before morning tea, as Lance has just said, and we'll have a couple of Zoom talks after. So we see how we go, and Rick Van Keulen is not available to speak, so we have a spare slot. So my first duty is to review yesterday's proceedings, and you'll all agree we had two fantastic sessions yesterday. They were very promising, but I think they even exceeded expectations. We began with Peter Rose telling us about the big, or the little six, which are small-bodied fish in the Murray-Darling Basin in a tri-state cooperative to try and work out how we best return their numbers, and identifying refuge habitats both in the main stem of the river systems, but also off-stem sites. And we saw examples of these fish and how in some places they're actually recovering quite rapidly. Nick Whiterod again talked about translocations, the Murray crayfish, which the text thread actually called the I'm OK fish. So I don't know why we need to translocate a fish that thinks it's okay. And he also focused on the Yarra pygmy perch, which is critically endangered, and the Murray hardyhead, which seems to be thriving up around Lake Victoria at the moment, which was a very good piece of news, given we know how threatened that is. Lawrence Berry gave us a fantastic talk on the main mammal fauna at Scotia, north of Wentworth in New South Wales. They're mixing gene pools to try and improve their robustness, of course, and bringing species together, or individuals together from various species, such as numbats and woylies and the like, and what's a really great prospect in terms of their survival inside the fence, as he declared, but hopefully we can work on outside the fence. Ricky Spencer came in on Zoom to talk about the 1 Million Turtles program, and there were some fairly daunting statistics about fox killings and taking of nests in the order of 95 to 100% efficiency when you have a number of foxes in the landscape. So that's what they're battling. He showed us floating islands at turtle nesting sites. Also talked about nesting beaches. So there are a range of ideas on how to enable our turtles, who are dwindling in many places and need a hand to improve their populations, how we can protect them from foxes and increase their numbers. Lisa Farnsworth gave us a rundown on what we're endeavouring to do here at Winton with respect to growlers, and I think we sort of drifted off into issues of approvals and difficulties of getting through the paperwork. But nevertheless, it seems at Winton here that we may have an opportunity to release growlers in the near future. And then Martin Potts finished us off with his usual flourish in the Room to Move study of looking again at golden and growling grass frogs and how they take up different habitats depending upon the availability of fresh water, which is moderated, of course, by whether we have a wet season like this or a dry season. And I was reminded there to think about variability, because in this room 2 years ago, we were all in despair about having to manage wetlands under a drought. But nowadays, you know, there are wetlands in the mainstream of towns in northern New South Wales and southern Queensland at the moment, so the climate can switch, and the fauna and the flora have responded for millennia to that sort of variability, and we probably could take the lesson of writing variability more into how we plan for these reintroductions. But that was an excellent session in the morning. In the afternoon, we had a community of practice session. Dennis O'Brien told us about the history of the site here, and from over the last 10 or 15 years or so, which was as much as anything an effort by the government to smooth relations with neighbours, one of which I enjoyed a lovely dinner last night, and starting off with quite considerable funding, but then seeing how those resources can be quite easily used up when you have such a large property to manage and such a diverse array of needs in terms of environmental restoration. Sophie Bickford presented on the evolution of the BioLinks Alliance, which has been going for 10 years or so, highlighting networking, advocacy, brokering funds, and introducing their new local to landscape programs. And again, we had Paul present further on their programs at Paul Foreman at dinner last night. Sophie emphasised the need for leadership and that time is short. And I think we got the impression that these groups emerged 10 or 15 years ago under a lack of patience of government progress and a lot of the needs and general identification of the rate of loss. So I think there's an emergence over the last 10 or 15 years of these communities to address that gap in progress. Dylan McGuinney gave a superb talk on the Albury Conservation Company. It's not an alliance or cooperative, it's a company. And they're working particularly around housing development west of Albury and road development with an emphasis on squirrel gliders as their icon species, but looking at hollows in general and bringing about ecological monitoring with the community, which is a theme for most of these groups. Mark Backman, a regular here at Winton, gave us an update on not the work he's doing, but the evolution of Nature Glenelg Trust. And that was a great insight to see how they went from a couple of $100 from the back pocket to what's now a multi-million-dollar program with 35 staff. So it is possible to go from little things to big. Sophie Enders presented on the, let me get this right, rivers and ranges, swamps, rivers and ranges, which is a group emerging in the northeast, has been around for 7 years with a small hiatus in the middle, she emphasised, but they're certainly now moving to develop similar sort of programs. But a bit like our group that I talk about, the Bunurong Landscape Alliance, we started a bit later, we're a little bit behind, but we can draw on the examples and the successes of these other groups that have been much more well established. Sophie emphasised education, monitoring, collaboration, and developing resources for the community, which I think is another common theme amongst all the groups. And the Bunurong Landscape Alliance, like many of the other groups, is emphasising the importance of monitoring. And we need to remember that we've embarked upon natural resource management as community groups for decades, but there was an intent of not funding monitoring and research in the early days, and we're now playing catch up. And I think it's really important to see how nearly all these groups are now writing monitoring into the doing, so we can learn as we go. I'll leave it there if anybody wants to add anything to yesterday's proceedings, but I think that was a great day and captured everybody's attention for the whole day. So we'll move on to today's agenda, and we have Ben Zeman from Glenelg Hopkins CMA to tell us about grassland ecology and management in the Glenelg Hopkins.
Slides? Yep. There it is. It's loading. There we go. Cool.
There we go. You can just
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, so I've come up from Glenelg Hopkins down in southwest Victoria, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the grasslands in our area, because it is a bit of a different area to up here. But I'll focus mainly on restoration and a couple of different approaches to grassland restoration that we've been involved with over the last few years. So if you're not exactly sure where Glenelg Hopkins is, it's this area in the red there down the southwest corner of Victoria. So it runs sort of south of the Dividing Range. We have about 70% of the Grampians that sits in our region, and then sort of goes to the border along the coast. And then if you basically go past Warrnambool and then sort of a jagged line up to Ballarat, and that's Glenelg Hopkins. And this, it's got several bioregions, but the bioregion I'm going to focus on is this big grey area. So this is the Victorian Volcanic Plain, and we have about a bit over half of the Victorian Volcanic Plain that sits in Glenelg Hopkins. And this is a really important bioregion for native grasslands, but it's also really important for wetlands as well. So it makes up about 46% of our region, so it's the dominant bioregion that we have. It's basically a geological landform, so this is a volcanic landscape that's pretty young, so we've got eruption points that date back to around 5 million years ago to the most recent around 10,000 years ago. It's a very young landscape, very fertile. If you drive through it, you'll see these volcanic eruption points through the landscape. A lot of them are quite tall and sort of like rise about 150 metres above the plains. It's also really species rich. So we've just within the Glenelg Hopkins region, we've had about 1,300 native plant and animal species that have been recorded, which is more than any other bioregion we have in our region, despite the fact that there's actually very little habitat that's been left. So there's a lot more habitat left in the Grampians, but there are more species that we have been recorded on the VVP. And it accounts for about 67% of the species that have been recorded in Glenelg Hopkins. And about, probably around 80% of the landscape's cleared, and probably even more of that for the grasslands. Probably you're looking close to around 95% has been cleared when you're looking at grasslands. So that biodiversity tends to be restricted to quite small areas, but really high quality patches that we find, a lot of it on roadsides, as well as on farms, and then we have a small number of reserves in the landscape. And so it is a really fertile landscape, which is probably why it's been favoured for agricultural development over the last couple of hundred years, and that's put a lot of pressure on these native systems. So the grass, so it's these grasslands that I'm talking about, the natural temperate grassland of the VVP. And these are an ecosystem where diversity is dependent on having frequent disturbance, and that tends to be frequent fire disturbance. Because what will happen if we don't have fire in these landscapes, the dominant grasses, and here it tends to be kangaroo grass, Themata triandra, it's super competitive and it will actually outcompete everything else that's in the system. So we'll see these everlasting daisies and the featherheads, sun orchids and creamy candles. They can't compete with Themata in the absence of fire. And it can actually get to a point where the Themata can actually start smothering itself under the build-up of its own dead litter, because the leaves on Themata, they only live for a year and just keeps producing new foliage each year, but it's really high in silica. It just sits in the ecosystem and actually starts to smother out the living tussock if you sort of push it past that decade. So we have some really high quality areas in the landscape, and that's resulted because of frequent burning. So on our roadsides, we've got quite wide roadsides, looking at sort of, sometimes 30-metre wide roadsides that were originally set up in the landscape as stock travelling routes back when you had to walk your stock around through the landscape. But because they probably weren't getting grazed that often, they were probably seen as a fire hazard pretty early on, and so people started burning them. And that continues right up to now. And it's just a coincidence that that burning has been the ideal form of management for these systems. And it tends to burn in sort of summer and into autumn, where a lot of these types of plants that are really sensitive to competition with Themata have also probably died back to dormant tubers below the soil surface at that stage. And so they're probably never going to get directly exposed to the heat of fire. And there was a paper that came out just last week looking at grassland fires and showing just a 5-degree increase in the soil temperature. So heat is going to be transferred away from the soil surface. So everything that's at the basically surface level and below the soil surface is going to be really well protected from fire. So this is an ecosystem that's really well adapted to frequent burning. And so this slide is a little bit depressing, but this is basically the distribution, the VVP in Glenelg Hopkins, and these dark areas here are the historical distribution of native grassland, and you'll see just little bits of green, and that's the basically the model distribution of what's left. We've spent a lot of time walking through this landscape and having a really good look around, and as depressing as this map may be, we actually think that it's probably overstating how much grassland's out there. We reckon there's probably a lot less than what the modelling is actually predicting. The model tends to predict that most of it is on private land, but I reckon it's probably about 50-50 between private lands and on the roadsides as far as grassland that's left. So there is a real need for restoration in this ecosystem. And so at Glenelg Hopkins, we do quite a bit of work with private landholders, because as I said, probably around half of it, I reckon, is on private land. And so we have these stewardship programs where we work with farmers in the area that have these native grasslands remaining on their farms. And we also work in seasonal herbaceous wetlands and the volcanic plain grassy woodlands as well. These areas tended not to have had that history of burning, but they tend to have had a grazing history instead. And so they do tend to be quite different types of grasslands to what we see on the roadsides. The grazing to an extent has helped to limit the competition of those dominant native grasses, but it also means there's a whole heap of native species that are sensitive to grazing that we just don't see on private land. So they basically, what we see on private land is almost a subset of the diversity we see on those roadsides. So through this program, we work with landholders to try and improve that disturbance regime. We have quite a few where we're able to start reintroducing a burning regime into these sites, but that's not for everyone. For some people, that's just a little bit difficult, not really practical to burn on their farms. And so we try to work out a way of trying to grazing in a more conservation-focused way. So that might be maybe having smaller paddocks and having a crash grazing regime, trying to mimic fire as close as we can, so having like high stocking rates, really short periods of time and get the stock out. Around that same period of time, we would expect fire to be in this system. It's not going to be as good as fire, but it's probably better than just treating it as a paddock. And we've got some monitoring that goes on alongside that to see how that plays out. And through that stewardship project, it's been a really good opportunity to actually get out on private land and have a really good look around and see what's remaining out there. And so we surveyed a lot of land throughout 2018 and 2019. So about 12,000 hectares, we were able to get out and actually walk around and drive around and try and find these remnants. And so we found quite a lot of seasonal basis wetlands. This really is a hot spot for seasonal basis wetlands in Victoria. And so we find them quite easily, but grasslands are really, really hard. So with all of that searching, we actually only found 25 native grassland remnants that totaled about 250 hectares. And what we tended to find is that the most diverse native grasslands on private land tended to actually be quite small. And so they would have these kind of weird little histories where they might be in the corner of a property that's been cut off by a creek. And so what's happened is sheep have only ever wandered across when that creek's been dry in summer. They've had a bit of a graze and then they've wandered out again. And we often find when we find really good grasslands, they've got weird little histories like that. There are some areas that have probably been more in a traditional grazing sense. And although they might be dominated by something like Poa Lab, they don't really have a lot of diversity in them. So it's those small little weird spots where most of the diversity on farms tends to be. And then I suppose the other thing that we learned from doing all this work is just that we need to take a lot of caution when we're using those distribution models, because we really do feel like they're overstating how much is there. And so we also get to do quite a lot of work on the roadside native grassland. So as I said, really wide roadsides and a long history of burning. And at the moment, this is burnt by CFA volunteers. It's probably the most important conservation action that happens on grasslands on the VVP. And it's being done by volunteers who, although a lot of them do think these grasslands are important, that's not the reason they're doing it. They're doing it to protect their communities from fire. And we are seeing that this practice of roadside burning is in decline across the landscape, which is a real concern for grasslands. But with this work, we support the CFAs where we can to get these burns done. We've also got quite a few key sites that we monitor, some really good high quality sites. We've got some brigades that are finding it difficult to burn in summer and now want to start doing their burning earlier in the season, so sort of burning sort of late November into December. We've got some reasons why we think that probably isn't going to be ideal, because a lot of these sensitive plants that we see in the system, they're kind of flowering at that point in time. Even the grasses, they're sort of flowering at that period of time and setting seed. So if you're going to have regular burning early in the season, you're probably going to see over time those species drop out. But we've got some monitoring plots set up to just see how that plays out. We don't really have good data on that yet. If it turns out that maybe you can burn early one year and then maybe leave it for a couple of years, so you get a couple of years of reproduction for the plants in between fires, then maybe it's okay, but we'll see how that plays out. And then we've also got quite a few projects that are focused on key species. So one, we focus a lot here on Ruidodosis leptorhynchoides, the button wrinklewort. So with this species, we've done quite a bit of work with Monash Uni, looking at the population genetics. This is obviously quite small populations. We've got about 12 populations in the region, and they're all very isolated. So we want to know, is it okay to start mixing populations together to increase genetic diversity? So Monash have been helping us with that. Also some work with the Botanic Gardens looking at seed viability. The good news story for this species is it's super genetically diverse. So we're looking, got this weird kind of chromosomal mutation that's happened in Western Victoria, where it's got basically double the number of chromosomes, which has been really good for genetic diversity. So although we've got populations of sort of 50 plants, genetic diversity is still really high, and seed viability is really high. So this has been a really good species to work with because it's quite successful. We've actually been able to get quite a few populations set up now on private land. And I'll talk about one of those in a minute. But clearly, yeah, this is an ecosystem that's really under pressure. A lot of it's been cleared, so there is a real need for restoration. So I'm going to focus on a couple of different types of restoration. The first restoration by improving the disturbance regime. So the logic here is that the condition of the grassland may be declining because you've taken fire out. So maybe it's as simple as just putting fire back in and we'll start to see the system recover. So we'll talk about that. And then there's also this more dramatic approach to grassland restoration, which is basically scalping out the top 10 centimetres of soil, all of the vegetation with it, as well as the seed bank and the nutrient loads. So basically starting with a clean slate and then re-sowing the grassland community on top of that. And so this is a method that Paul Gibson-Roy developed, and he's had some really good success with it. And we started doing some of that with our work in Glenelg Hopkins. But two very different approaches, and it's probably going to depend a lot on what your starting scenario is as to which approach you go with. So the first one I'll focus on, so this is restoration by improving the disturbance regime. And this is a site in Dunkeld that's owned by Wannon Water. It adjoins their water treatment plant. It's this grassland woodland site, which is actually really rich in herbs, particularly orchids and lilies, really species-rich site. It's also got quite a few threatened species. We've got striped legless lizards that live here, growling grass frogs, clumping golden moth orchids, and we've got Anthobromus pythogastus, the plump wallaby grass, up the end there. This is a species that was only discovered at this site probably a decade ago. Prior to that, there probably wasn't many plants thought to be in the wild, but here we're probably looking at a population potentially in the tens of thousands. It's everywhere, it's all through the site. However, this site doesn't have native daisies, which is really weird because all of the roadsides around here are full of native daisies, and it also doesn't have Themata, which is the dominant native grassland, dominant native grass in all the grasslands around here. And instead, this site is actually dominated by non-native grass, the Anthoxanthum odoratum, or the sweet vernal grass. So about 10 years ago, an experiment was set up with Wannon Water and some consultants to see what would happen if they started reintroducing a burning regime to this site. So established back in 2012, and they divided the site up into a series of plots. Some of these they started burning every year, and then some they started burning every 4 years. And so we've now had a decade to actually see how this ecosystem responds to that. And basically what we've seen is that the number of native species we're seeing in each 30 metre by 30 metre plot is steadily increasing over time in those sites that get burned every year. So that seems to be the appropriate burning regime for this site. However, what we're not seeing is really any change to the sweet vernal grass. So you see it go up and down a little bit, which is probably due to rainfall, as well as an initial decline after a fire, but it then recovers pretty well following fire. So burning has actually not been effective at all at controlling this non-native grass. It also hasn't brought back any of the species that are missing from this site. So there's been no daisies that have popped up. Themata hasn't popped up anywhere. So those things that we thought should be at this site haven't popped up by reintroducing fire. And the reason why those species haven't been coming back can probably be answered by this excellent review paper that came out last year, which reviewed all of the literature on restoring grasslands by improving the disturbance regime. A real focus on going from a grazing regime to a burning regime. And overall, they found that when this is done, there's actually no change in native species richness. So you're not increasing your native species by switching to a burning regime. It's not increasing the weeds either, so it's not like there's a problem with burning. There's not a cost to it, but there's no benefit as far as increasing species go. But they were finding that you would get a positive result if you actually coupled that switch in disturbance regime with seed addition. So you start burning, and then you also couple that with putting seed back into it and try and get the species back in that way. Or the alternative was if the remnant they were working on was really close to an adjoining remnant where immigration from that remnant into the site was possible. And so the reason why we don't see those plants come back is, unfortunately for temperate grasslands, they don't have a long-lived seed bank. So this study by John Morgan, going back a while ago now, found that just 12% of grassland species were identified to have a persistent seed bank, and a lot of those tend to be annuals. So this puts grasslands at a real disadvantage. I know I've seen in seasonal basis wetlands, and I know Michelle does work in seasonal basis wetlands, where they do have a seed bank. It just makes restoration a lot easier Grasslands, unfortunately, don't have that, which makes things hard. So going back to our Dunkeld site, we've been able to show, over a decade now, just a slow increase in the number of native species in our plots. So the species that are already there, we're able to increase the density of them. So clearly the burning is favouring what's there. However, it's not effective at controlling the weeds. So sweet vernal grass, probably like most of our invasive grasses, I know Phalaris does the same thing, it just resprouts following fire. So fire is not in itself a control method for getting rid of these species. So we're now entering a new phase in this experiment. So this is Aggie, who I work with, is out planting some button wrinkerworts. This is one of the sites where we're establishing button wrinkerwort into the site. And this year, Wan and Water are going to start getting hoary sunray in here, so the Leucochrysum albicans, another endangered daisy in our region. And then working with, so I should say that over the last 4 years when I've been working on this, it's been with John Morgan at La Trobe. And so John's going to start getting, adding seed to those 30 metre by 30 metre plots. So we've done 10 years of burning. Let's now get seed back in, as well as planting some of those particularly sensitive species, and keep the experiment running and just see how that plays out. See if we can get the species richness increasing that way. Okay, so that's one method, improving a site by improving the disturbance regime. But clearly, if you do that, you also need to think about adding seed to it. I'm now going to move on to that more dramatic way of restoring grasslands. And these images here are actually of a couple of restored grasslands at Warndoo. And this is a restoration project that the local community down there have been running. So they're working on roadsides that used to be cropped, and they've been able to scalp out these sites, re-sow with a mix of native grasses and native herbs, and then over time they are adding species that they weren't able to get up with seed. So they were able to experiment and work out, okay, what plants come up with seed, which ones don't. So they got those ones that can with seed straight away, and now they're adding chewed stock to these sites to increase the complexity over time. And so this is the method that the Paul Gibson Roy sort of pioneered for grassland restoration. And they've done so far, they initially did a 1.25 hectare patch on the roadside, and now they've done a second patch. And they're getting really good results. We actually find that these sites are pretty resistant to weed invasion too, once you get rid of that topsoil and that weed seed bank. So we were quite inspired with the results that Warndoo have had on their sites. And so we started thinking about where this type of grassland restoration could work to actually complement existing high quality sites. And so as I said, our really good sites are on the roadsides. But we do have this pattern where we'll have a really nice patch of native grassland, and then we'll get a patch underneath that that will just be dense Phalaris. And that Phalaris will be a barrier to native species dispersal. And native species just can't get through that. Really thick grass sward, really competitive. Phalaris is way more competitive than Thebeta. And grassland plants can't really disperse over the top because we actually know that most of these species drop their seed sort of within a metre or two of the adult plants. So they're not really dispersing very far either. So we're thinking this method that the Warndoo have pioneered, if we could actually target those areas of Phalaris, scout that out, what we could do is we'll actually increase the connectivity of those really high quality sites along our roadsides. And so we initially spent some time basically trying to find where this pattern was really obvious in the landscape, and we started walking these sites. Basically, so this is the Penshurst Dunkeld Road. The white indicates a really good patch, and then we're hitting a blue patch, which was just Phalaris. And so we walked these sites, put together a species list. So if we do decide to scalp that, we know exactly what we're taking out. And you are going to find a couple of native species in amongst all that Phalaris, but they're probably on borrowed time. Phalaris will probably knock them out eventually. So I'd identified a few sites where this was happening, and then our other source of inspiration was this paper that was published in Science back in 2019. And this is a really long-running study of reconnecting grassland remnants, or the corridors between grassland remnants. So this was a series of plots where you had grasslands that weren't connected, that would become isolated, whereas you had other grasslands where they actually kept a little corridor, so you would actually see whether that corridor over time would provide a benefit. And they were able to see just small benefits initially, so you would see a slow dropping in the number of plants that were occurring in those isolated sites, and a slow increase in the diversity between those connected remnants. But what they found is that the longer that the experiment went, the greater the benefits they had from reconnecting. And so it wasn't like that benefit just plateaued at some point. They've now been running this for 18 years, and they're still finding that they're getting a benefit out of this experiment. So those connected sites are getting, basically they're sharing species, so you're getting greater diversity amongst those sites that are connected, whereas those isolated sites have identified that they're losing species at a rate around 2% a year. Okay, so this is our Dunkeld Penshurst row we're focusing on. So this is our really high quality stuff. Thermida dominated, really herb rich, but then we're running into these broken patches of Phalaris. So using that study as well as the Warndoo group, we decided to focus on this road and reconnect these patches of really good stuff by restoring the stuff in the middle. And so that got scalped last year. This is what it looks like. Basically, we're working with Regional Roads Victoria to complete this, so we wouldn't be able to undertake this work without partnering with someone like Regional Roads Victoria, because the disadvantage with this type of grassland restoration is that it is really, really expensive. But basically, Regional Roads have come in and basically that's been their in-kind contribution to this project by actually doing the scalping for us. And then we've had farmers in the area that have been happy to take topsoil donations, so that's been good to get rid of the soil. So we're basically looking at taking out 1.5 kilometres of Phalaris to reconnect 5 kilometres of really high quality linear grassland. And about 2.5 hectares of this site will be sown this year. And then we're working with La Trobe Uni with this, who will set up a long-term monitoring project, sort of following that model of the US study. David Franken, the local grassland champion in our region who works with Warndoo, is doing a lot of the seed sowing for us. This here is about nearly 50 kilograms of seed, and that's what's required just to do about a quarter of the project. So we're going to need 4 times that, about 200 kilograms of seed, which is really difficult to source that. So there is a real need, if you're doing grassland restoration, for seed production areas, and at the moment we just don't have that, so that makes things really tricky, not just for doing these type of restoration projects, but also when we're looking at improving sites by improving the disturbance regime. We're only going to get so much benefit by doing that. We need the seed for those sites as well. So all our landholders that we're working with and getting them to burn their sites, we also want to be able to put seed into those sites. And so Dave has this modified turf renovator that he uses to actually sow that seed. So it creates little divots, puts the seed in, presses the seed down. And he reckons that's actually a pretty sensitive way of getting seed into sites. And it's sensitive enough, he reckons you could be able to use that in remnant grasslands that are pretty low in diversity as a method of getting seed back in. Cool. I'll leave it there, but if I have any time for questions, I'm happy to take some.
Thank you, Ben. You have left a little time for questions. Yeah. One here.
Do I need a mic or everyone else? My name's Mark. I'm from Bendigo. I live in Box Ironbark country, not your country.
Yep.
2 questions. How much per hectare does it cost to scalp and restore? And if I put my stock on a native grassland,
Yep.
instead of improved pasture or annual, will my profit margin be the same, more or less? What do you reckon?
Okay, I'll start with the first one, so the cost of restoration. Regional Roads Victoria have estimated the cost of scalping those sites at about $100,000. So when you're looking at not that many hectares to get that, it's really expensive, really expensive. That's the most expensive part. Luckily, they're taking care of that for us, but it does restrict how much we can restore. And then getting the seed, and probably just be able to establish an industry where you can have seed production areas that you can actually get seed from. is needed as well, and there's going to be costs in setting something like that up. And then the second part of your question was?
If I've got a paddock,
Yep,
if I've got a paddock
yep,
and it hasn't got phalaris,
Yep.
and I encouraged the native vegetation back,
yep.
if I put my stock on per hectare, will I make the same amount of money?
As opposed to being on Phalaris?
Phalaris is pretty rank as opposed to the normal annual grasses. In other words,
Yeah.
if I encourage
yeah, I see what you're
people-
saying. I don't think.
what's the point?
native
'Cause I
gra-
think
yeah.
you're saying we've got a lot of native grass on roadsides.
Yep.
There's not a lot of roadsides. If we can encourage people with stock
Yep.
to get it on their private property, I assume it would not be as good as a pristine grassland, but it would be better than nothing. Do you think that's possible? Because
Like, I don't know how it would go as far as being productive for stock. I suspect that it's going to be a lot less productive. That's why a lot of it was replaced with pasture grasses. So you're probably going to you'll be running less stock on it. Where native pasture has been favoured, it's been traditional wool growing areas because you get finer wool off nutrient poor grasses. So that being the case, I'd say you're going to be running less stock. And whether it's an option for grassland restoration, again, might be good for grasses, but it's probably not going to be good for the community as a whole because a lot of those species that are really dropping out of these sites are going to be pretty sensitive to grazing. Yeah.
They do undertake cell grazing
Yep.
on native grasslands in some private property places, and that's a way of managing grasslands.
Yep.
And they still make money out of it, I think.
Yeah, okay. Yep.
Okay, it was Mark. One last quick question. We do have a discussion session after the grassland talk, so
I was just wondering about the cost you were talking about for the scalping. Was that increase? Did they take the topsoil away from the roadside?
Yeah, so they took it away. Luckily, it was the neighbouring farmers that were happy to take the soil, so they didn't have to take it very far. But that was included in their in-kind contribution, is they put it on a truck
Right.
and shipped it across.
I was wondering if that was driving the cost up because that sounded. Do you know how many hectares that covered the works for that 100,000?
Yeah, it's like
It's not a
2
lot,
hectares.
obviously.
Yeah, it's not much.
Presumably, the fact that those sites are all broken up doesn't help. Like,
Yeah,
it would
so
be more
it's
cost
like a
effective
5
to do.
kilometre stretch. So yeah, and it took them a bit over a week. So it's having 10 guys and quite a bit of machinery on there for a bit over a week. Yeah.
okay, we'll move on to our next speaker, who is Graham Coulson, to come forward in the program. Kangaroos in grasslands, habitat, herbivory and hypotheses.
That'll take me forward, yeah. Good.
And of course, as Ben's reminded us, it was in the 80s we were focusing on rainforest and forests, and I think once we got over that in the 90s, we suddenly realised that grasslands were more endangered than rainforests. And so there's been a lot of research and some great developments which we've seen in terms of managing grasslands and recovering the losses.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Peter. And thanks to the Wetlands for the invitation to talk. And I'll stress at the outset, this is about kangaroos in grasslands. It's mostly about kangaroos, not much about grasslands per se. And I'll be talking about habitat and herbivory mostly. A little bit of hypotheses, not too much theory, but a bit towards the start and a bit towards the end. And those dots are not sheep. Okay, from a kangaroo's point of view, the world is divided into two things. In fact, most species really. They need cover, which provides shelter from extremes of weather, so shade, get out of the rain, get out of the wind. Also shelter from predation, so you can gallop in there and hide during disturbance. And they also need food, which is basically grass, as you'll see. And this sort of habitat is pretty much perfect because everything's close by. So you've got an open grassy clearing to feed on, cover to duck into, go over the next hill, there's another grassy clearing, and so on. In some situations, you may have a sharp boundary like a state forest up against a farm. The roos will commute backwards and forwards across that boundary, as you all know. In other cases, you may have really large areas of of open foraging area and just little clumps of cover. So you've got to have the two of them to keep a kangaroo happy, but they can be arranged in all sorts of ways. So roos deal with this in a behavioural way by forming groups, so particularly when they have to go out into wide open spaces. And they are gregarious, they don't like being alone, they'll always try and find another kangaroo, and how much of that joining together influences two things. So you've got this effect on vigilance. The larger the group size, the less time they have to spend standing up, looking around and not eating. Instead, all they have to do is tune into what their neighbours are doing. If one of them suddenly leaps up or hops away or thumps its feet, you know there's a problem. So they can save time by looking around. You can see what they're spending it on. The larger the group is, the more time they spend foraging. So those two give us these two hypotheses. The first one's called the detection effect, and you're simply benefiting from all those many eyes and ears that are scanning the world for danger. And the second one is a little more cynical. This is called the dilution effect. And this has got nothing to do with scanning. This simply says if you're that roo in the middle there, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 other roos in your group. So that gives you a 1 in 6 chance of being eaten. If you join into a group of 12, you've immediately halved your chance of being eaten again, and so on. So that's the dilution or the selfish herd hypothesis, that one's called. So in other words, even when they come out into the open, when they are exposed to danger, they can adjust for that by forming groups. And those groups are open membership, so there's no limit on joining or leaving a group. A roo can hop into another group, hop across to another group. It doesn't matter what size that group is, what the composition of the group is, it can simply come and go. It's often called a fission-fusion society, so those groups just split apart, join together on a more or less random basis. And because it's random, it gives us this extra effect where the larger or the higher the population density, the more roos there are, the larger the groups become. So this graph shows a series of dots for grassy woodlands, and you can see as the population density increases, the group size gets bigger. That's actually a log scale, so it gets a lot bigger. There's a couple of triangles down here. They're in a forest. So the groups don't have to be as big in a forest because you've got the shelter of the forest itself. That provides the security. So what happens when you go into something really big and open? Many years ago, we worked at this property down near Warrnambool, just north of Warrnambool. Absolutely no cover at all, apart from a bit of a windbreak around the homestead and some planting along the creek there. That's a high voltage power line running down there. What did the roos do? This was the graph that you saw before. This is what you'd expect in a woodland. They were way up here. And in fact, on most days, every roo on that property would be in the one group. So they were compensating for this lack of cover by sticking together all the time. So that's a bit of behavioural aspects of how kangaroos do things. We'll have a look now at diet. The simplest way to look at diet is to see what's coming out the other end. So you can examine the faecal pellets and look at the microscopic structure of the food. The problem with that is that that's been through the digestive process. So the softer, more digestible components have already disappeared by that stage. So it's a lot better to get gut samples. And in fact, it's even better to take those samples right at the start of the stomach, just as the esophagus enters the stomach. And then you can get the most recently ingested food components. And then you look at them under the microscope and match them up to a library that you've created of all the food in that area that you're interested in. Now, if these species don't look familiar, there's a good reason. They're from a rock wallaby study in East Gippsland. So they're not the sort of things you'd see here, but you get the idea. You can look at both, you can identify both species and plant parts from this microhistology. So for any given site, you might have 150, 200 species that you've got to sample, prepare, and you prepare them in a way that sort of mimics what happens to them as they go through the animal's gut. And then you look at your animal samples and see what sort of species you've got in the diet. But to cut the long story short, basically when we're talking roos, it's grass, 90% on average, but the composition of the grass species in that could differ quite a bit. Now, the other way to look at diet is to look more at an impact level and to see what the roos are eating on the landscape. And the most obvious ones are things like tree guards. Clearly something is eating these. So we can look at exclosures to get a better idea of what's going on. And there are grazing exclosures put up all over the place. There's probably thousands of them in Australia. This big one down on Maria Island in Tasmania, one at Hanging Rock and so on, they all basically show the same thing and they all have the same sort of limitations. What they're showing is a complete absence of herbivory, which is almost never going to happen. So it tells you something. It tells you what would happen if you had no herbivores in your system at all, but it also gets into complications of time. So the longer they stay in place, the more the internal plant dynamics, the sort of things that Ben was talking about before with species choking each other out, they become increasingly important and they start to represent something completely different to what would happen if you simply took a herbivore away. The other problem is that you have, in many places, multiple species. So that one over on the left, the one on Maria Island, actually had grey kangaroos, Bennett's wallabies, paddy melons, wombats, brush-tailed possums that spend a lot of time on the ground in Tasmania, and Cape Barren geese. They were all contributing to that difference between the two sides of the fence. And that had only been up for about 6 months when I took that photo. So one way to deal with that is to use selective exclosures. So I don't know what this is looking like back there, but the one on the left is rabbit and roo proof at the back. So it's got a fence high enough to keep the roos out and mesh down the bottom. The one on this side of you is just rabbit proof, so a low bunny fence and the roos can obviously hop over it. So if they were the two main species in this system, then you'd be able to distinguish the impacts of those two. And you'd compare those two plots with the outside to see what the combined effect of those two species was. This one's rather different. This is one in Upper Yarra catchment where there's a big issue with sambar deer. So this one's designed to keep sambar out and to let swamp wallabies in. And we had others that would keep out both of them. So you can do a bit of fine tuning, and in some systems it's possible to separate the effects of the key herbivores in your system. Not always, but it can be done. Take it even further, this is some really nice work being done in the conservation park in Canberra, or the Canberra Nature Parks, they're called. All of the nature reserves around Canberra are lumped into the one park, effectively. These are called pasture cages, and they allow you to do a lot of really nice things. As you can see, they're really low tech. The white mesh around the top is just to stop the roos from banging into them at night, so otherwise they get knocked over. You can see in winter in Canberra, basically there's nothing. There's no growth. It's too cold. Nothing happens with the grasslands. But in spring and summer, these grasslands really take off. And you can measure 3 key variables with these things. The first is standing crop, so simply what there is above the ground level, and you cut that off, weigh it, dry it, and you get a figure per hectare. The second one you get is production. So inside that cage, it's just been put in place. No, it hasn't happened yet, but the first thing that will happen is you'll cut it off to ground level, put the cage in, and then wait however long you want to do it for, usually a season, and measure what's been produced, so that's the growth rate. And the third thing is the offtake, so the difference between that and what's been chewed off outside. So those 3 measures allow us to do all sorts of nifty things. So you can see the figure for Themida here, bottom left. what that's telling us is that the kangaroos in this system are basically eating the Themata as fast as it grows. So the red line at the top there, 15 kilograms of dry matter, dried grass per hectare per day is what's grown in those plots, and that's also what's been taken off. So as fast as Themata grows in the growing season, kangaroos are mowing it off. Phalaris, not quite so popular, but it's still got the same sort of relationship. They don't eat it as fast as it grows, but they'll certainly still get stuck into it. But then there's an important effect of standing crop, and this also relates to something that Ben was saying. Themata, you get this big tussocky thatch with a lot of dry leaves and dead stuff, and you get to a point where the standing crop is simply too high. It's not attractive to the roos. As you all know, they like the grass short and green. So a big rank pasture of Themata, while it's a preferred species, is not going to be very interesting to the roos. They don't take off much. And the same with Phalaris, of course. It has the same effect, only even worse. So they're the sort of things that give you an idea about the pasture dynamics and the herbivore response to those dynamics. And as I say, the Canberra ACT Parks and Conservation have done some fantastic work on this, and we understand a lot more about how things work from what they've been doing. So, the other thing is you can have an interaction with fire. So this is from just up the road at Reef Hills, done some time ago now, and it also relates to what people have been talking about. Grasslands need burning, but when you do, this is what happens. So down the bottom left, these are the burnt plots at Reef Hills, and this is using fecal pellets as a measure of how much kangaroo time is being spent on those plots. And you can see they're really going for the burnt plots, much less interested in the unburnt ones. So then the only way to get a response out of this system is to fence it. So the bit at the back was burnt and then fenced. The bit at the front was burnt, left unfenced, and basically mowed down to nothing. The roos don't have it all their own way. If you open up a kangaroo, and this is a perfectly healthy individual, you'll see a lot of finely chopped green stuff. It's like it's come out of a grass catcher on your mower, and you'll see these long wriggly worms. The big ones are about 10 centimetres long and a millimetre or two wide. There's also a lot of smaller ones you can see. That's a different species. And there are a whole lot that you can't see at all that are microscopic. And we're talking thousands and thousands of individuals in a normal, healthy kangaroo. But if the levels of the parasites get too high, then it certainly has an impact on animal health. So the roos also have to deal with this. I'll just show you a few mug shots. Some of them are pretty nice. These are light microscopes along the bottom. I like the Cloacina in particular. It looks a little bit like a Dalek, I reckon, except it doesn't have the plunger out the front. And they're electron microscopic images of just the mouth parts of these things. So this is how people tell them apart. But there's a whole fauna in there. There can be 20 or 30 species in each individual kangaroo. And as I say, thousands of individuals of those. So they're a bit of fun. But the kangaroos do have to deal with them. So they do that by avoiding fecal contamination. And of course, domestic stock and lots of other herbivores do the same thing. So for this little experiment, we set up a checkerboard, but it was a randomised checkerboard. So on the black squares, we put all the pellets from the next door white square. So we went around, picked them all up, and you can see them on there, marked them out with bits of string and coloured pegs so we knew where we were. And then we sat back in a hide and watched what the kangaroos did across this checkerboard. And as you can see, the proportion of time they spent foraging in the uncontaminated, the white ones, the cleared ones, was much higher than in the contaminated ones. They'd still enter the contaminated squares, but they'd quickly move out of them and then spend time in the contaminated ones. And you can look at other ways of this sort of analysis. You can simply follow the foraging path of a kangaroo and see, again, that it'll avoid the contaminated patches and concentrate on the uncontaminated ones. which is fine until the density gets so high that everything's contaminated, of course. But it's a way that they're avoiding being reinfected by those parasites, because the parasites are passed as eggs through the fecal pellets of the roos. They then spend a few weeks developing into different larval stages, and then when they get to the third larval stage, they're infective, and then they're taken up in the next mouthful that the kangaroo has, and then they reinfect the kangaroo. So roos are trying to avoid that. They're also trying to find their preferred food. They're trying to avoid dense patches, so that's what they're up to when they're foraging across the landscape. So a bit of theory now. What we're looking at so far is almost entirely what's called bottom-up control. So literally, the kangaroos are controlled by what's down at ground level. If there's a lot of food, they will increase, and they'll, as we said, they'll eat it as fast as it grows. If the growth rate drops right off, like it does in Canberra in winter, the kangaroos are basically going to starve in the short term because they have reserves, they have fat, and they'll find little bits to eat, but they won't get much to eat. So how many roos there are in a particular area is driven entirely by the food resource beneath their feet in a bottom-up system. The other form of control or regulation is top-down, and this is where you've got predation coming down from the top of the animals effectively and killing them, or having more subtle effects such as making them spend less time in the open because that's where the risks are, or maybe form even larger groups which then get so crowded that they can't feed properly. They're the sort of effects, so either a direct predation effect or a behavioural response to that predation, which changes the, effectively changes the carrying capacity of the area for the kangaroos. And this brings us to what can happen when we have no top-down control. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples. This first one is from Serendip Sanctuary, which is managed by Parks Vic. It's near Lara, just near the Yuyangs in the background there. It's about 250 hectares, not very big, but it's an open system. It's got farmland on 3 sides and low-density houses, hobby farm style blocks on another side. And a number of things happen, but you can see a little kink in the graph here. This is where the sheep were taken off in the late 80s, and the kangaroos said, "Thank you very much." I've expressed that as density because they also lost a bit of habitat because there was some re-veg work going on which fenced off some areas so they didn't have as much space. But you can see the pattern. So by 2006, this is what it looked like. It was green, but it was billiard table short, and they were all working very hard to get food. This is what it was like 6 months later. And you can see the precipitate crash. The next drop was a cull done by Parks Vic, and then another cull after that. You can see a quick little recovery before the next cull too. So it had all sorts of impacts. There were a lot of road kills on the surrounding roads because they were going out and feeding in the drains. There were roos dropping dead in the picnic area and the rangers had to shoot them. Well, not if they were dead, but nearly dead. There was a very high prevalence of the disease lumpy jaw, which you hardly ever see in wild kangaroos. It's a problem for captive populations, but not for wild kangaroos. But about 40% of the population had lumpy jaw, which is a very nasty disease in its own right. And clearly that population had gone way beyond the ability of the environment to sustain it. It was triggered by a dry spell, but something had to give. You know, it couldn't stay at that peak for long. And the other one that you are probably more familiar with is good old Pucka. And it followed pretty much the same sort of trajectory, only it took a lot longer. So way back in the early 80s, the sheep were taken off, population bounced around for a while, had a bit of an up and down, and then it got to this point, and this time I've got actual numbers, 80,000 roos there, and in the next year, half of those had died. 40,000 kangaroos are staggering numbers. Continued down, there's been culling done since, but it's been a bit hit and miss. It hasn't been very regular. So I think it's not exactly sorted, that population either. Phalaris staggers are quite an issue here. So the kangaroos are again working pretty hard to find food. The early Phalaris shoots come up when there's not much else, and you get a toxicity that affects the brain and the eyes. So that's 2 examples. I could show you more, but I'll stop at that point. Thank you.
Worries me that roo control at Puckapunyal is hit and miss.
As soon as I said that, I knew that was a mistake.
We don't want to send, we're not going to send them to Ukraine.
No. No, the irony is that the army doesn't do the control. They get contractors in to do it. So even though they're bristling with firearms, they're not allowed to use them. It's really, they do run over a lot, though.
Okay, Graham has left some time for questions. Mark again.
If no one else will go, I will. That was great. Thanks, Graham. I'm just curious as to whether you've been able to do any research in places where the effect of top-down predation has been introduced, rather than it being done through guns, you know, through the reintroduction of an apex predator.
No, it's a really good question. It's a topic that is under hot discussion. It sort of heats up and then it cools down again. Nowhere has done it yet, but there's a lot of talk about it. There's some data that you can get in places like either side of the dog fence in Queensland and South Australia and New South Wales. But no one has yet done the dingo introduction experiment itself. Somewhere it might happen is in the new Wilson's Prom Sanctuary, which will have a predator-proof fence across the isthmus. All foxes and hopefully all cats will be removed inside the park, and then there'll be no top-down predation at all. And there's a lot of debate about reintroducing potentially Tassie devils or dingoes or maybe both. But at the moment, well, that's not going to happen for a number of years because a lot of the mid-sized prey species aren't there either. So it needs things like bettongs and paddy melons back before you do that. But yes, it's in the wings, but it's a hot topic, and yeah, it's a hard one to get through. But you know, places like the US reintroduced wolves to Yellowstone National Park. Enormous objection, but they did it, and it's worked really well, and it's had all sorts of dramatic effects on the vegetation. Good effects, that is. So, yep.
Mark stole my favourite question, but I'll ask my second question. I eat kangaroo, and my understanding is that even with all those parasites, they're quite a healthy meat to eat. But I also heard that perhaps the beef industry got a little bit threatened about the possibility of the kangaroo industry outcompeting them, and so did a bit of a scare campaign about how bad it is to eat, you know, meat that might be virus-ridden and etc. I don't know how true that is. Can you comment on any of that stuff if you know anything about it?
Yep, I can. The meat is fine. The parasites I showed you are gastrointestinal parasites, which domestic stock have as well. You don't eat that. There are some things that might be a risk, like salmonella, but that can apply again in any situation, provided there's good meat inspection and provided there's good control over the whole supply chain. And the guys who do that commercial shooting have to be accredited, and they've got to have very clean gear and the whole works. So it's not an issue, and it's ironic that both the parts of the meat industry and parts of the anti-kangaroo shooting brigade both use the same argument to say this is why you shouldn't shoot kangaroos. But it's perfectly safe meat, and as many of you know, it's also very healthy meat, very lean. But you do need to cook it properly. So as with any red meat product or any meat product, if you don't cook it sufficiently, it doesn't mean it doesn't have to be burnt, but it does have to reach a certain temperature to be safe from things like salmonella and a whole lot of other bacteria that can infect any meat that's just sitting around on your kitchen bench. So yeah, it's not an issue.
Yeah, I'm Philippa. The regenerative agriculture, some of the people are pushing the fact that we should graze our pastures like they do in Africa, where you get huge herds of animals coming through and then they leave it. And I often wonder how that can be comparable to the grazing of kangaroos Australian pastures. Can you comment on that?
The things like, well, grey kangaroos probably not. They are they're very sedentary. They don't move very far. So some of the young males might disperse to another area, but most of them just hang around and are actually very hard to shift. So they're not going to be able to do those large-scale movements that you might want for pulse grazing like that. Red kangaroos, on the other hand, do exactly that. So they're very, very like the wildebeest and the zebra. They will queue into a thunderstorm 50k away and go there. And you get this massive population increase in a very small area, and you think, where the hell have all these come from? But in fact, they've all just come in from the surrounding areas, and then later on they'll filter back out again. But I think, no, it'd be hard to do that with roos, and of course you can't manage them in the same way you could manage stock either. So I think if you're interested in pulse grazing, you'd use domestic stock that you could manipulate much more effectively.
Yeah, but would our landscape that isn't dominated by red kangaroos, would it have developed and evolved with that in mind? It's obviously evolved differently, hasn't it? Our native landscape in the higher rainfall areas would have evolved with the red kangaroos coming, the grey kangaroos being there permanently, just a different population.
Yes,
No.
yeah. We're talking about landscapes. If you're talking, a grassy woodland in this part of the world or in Lower Glenelg or wherever, they've evolved under a grazing regime, but those grazers have also evolved under a predation regime. So you would never have got the high densities that we see in some places like Serendip, because something like that would be such an attraction to a predator that they'd be in there too. I'm not sure if I've fully answered your question, but
well, what were our predators then? Was it dingoes?
Dingoes, yes. Indigenous people, of course. And before dingoes, we had the thylacine, which was in the news this morning, I saw. We're going to bring it back again, so that's good. So, yeah. Predators that operate in open country, they're the ones that kangaroos had to worry about, because as soon as they went out in the open to feed, they'd be exposed to a running predator like a little group of dingoes.
Okay, maybe one last question before the break, or we can... Dennis.
They do, mostly on the youngsters. There's pretty good evidence that they can take quite a high proportion of each year's crop of young. They get to a stage where when they're just leaving the pouch, they do these mad little gallops around and they're completely stupid, and they'll often go back to the wrong kangaroo, sometimes a male, try and get back into the pouch. And at that stage, they're often separated from their mothers if the mob suddenly has to move on, and they're highly vulnerable to foxes at that stage. As it's a bit older than that, they're probably too big for a fox to take down, but there are a few anecdotes of foxes taking sub-adults, sort of 18 months, 2 years of age as well. They're still, they'd only stand about so high. So foxes are pretty good predators.
One more quick one. We've had a bit of an issue with times neighbours complaining there were too many kangaroos here. Is there such a thing as an optimal?
Well, very hard to put a number on it, but it should be expressed in terms of what your management goals are. So for some places, an optimal density might be very low. So for example, in the Mallee parks, the target density for kangaroos in those parks is 5 kangaroos per square kilometre. At Serendip, it was 5 kangaroos per hectare. So you can't put a number on it easily, and it depends what you're managing your land for. So I think have I weaseled my way out of that? Oh yeah, well if you've got an open system, that's an added complication for sure. Yeah.
In the absence of predators south of the dog fence, it's all a guess. I mean, we don't know what the original densities were.
No, we don't. Yep. We know they're elevated, but we don't know by how much. Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll adjourn for morning tea. We're resuming at 11. I think we said before, Lance, we'll give you an update if that's any different. Any other announcements? Otherwise, please join me in thanking both Ben and Graham for very interesting talks this morning. Okay, we have two Zoom presentations. Firstly by Sally Mann, who you can see, and title there, Grasslands, what have you got? What should you do? How do you do it? So welcome, Sally.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the Whitten Wetlands Organisation for inviting me to speak today. And I hope I can tell you something of it that might be useful to you as grassland managers. I just want to make it clear that I am totally unqualified. I'm just somebody who has a lot of experience doing stuff. You might call me an enthusiastic amateur. Before I start, I just want to pay my respects to the traditional owners of all the lands that I've lived and worked on, and particularly the Bangarang and the Yorta Yorta peoples, whose care in the past created this beautiful country on which we meet. So, what have you got? What should you do and how do you do it? As you can possibly tell from the title of my talk, I'm a very practical person who likes to actually get on with things. And as well, because I'm now old, I'm also very impatient. Now, whoops. Oh, have you got slide 2? Just checking. Yes, hope so. Let me start by reminding you that grasslands are very productive. Think of pastures and cereal crops, and they're very dynamic. I'm sure you will have noticed that a grassy patch you often see looks different every season and every year. This means that their composition can be altered quite easily and quickly through intervention or indeed neglect. Grasslands are rapidly degraded by this productivity when they are not managed, but they are also able to be rapidly and dramatically improved. If you care about conservation, you really should have a go at improving your grassy understory, because in our region, most of our natural vegetation is grassy. We have plains grassland, plains grassy wetland, plains grassy woodland, grassy woodland, creekline grassy woodland, grassy dry forest, valley grassy forest, and even more that are also grassy but just don't have grassy in their names. Our grasses are also extremely diverse, with well over 50 species just on the plains. In Victoria's eastern northern plains, don't worry too much about the numbers, that's just some sites that happen to have threatened plants. Where I've done most of my recent work, only 3 of the more than 30 threatened plants are trees or shrubs. The majority are small plants that live amongst grassy vegetation. These figures indicate a decline that should ring alarm bells, and I believe we should be putting in a lot more effort to improve the health of our grassy ground layers. I'm going to assume you're here because you manage some grassy vegetation and would like to make it healthier and perhaps even more diverse with native plants. I want to encourage you to get stuck in, because what's left of our grassy vegetation urgently needs your help. Okay, what have you got? As a land manager, your first question might be, is it a natural grassland? The formal names for natural grassland are plains grassland, ecological vegetation class, or natural grasslands of the Murray Valley Plains, that's how it's listed in the Federal EPBC Act, or Northern Plains Grassland Community, which is how it's listed in the Victorian FFG. The best way to tell what was a grassland before clearing began is by looking at old survey maps. There are older and better ones than this, but this was all I could find online for this talk. This is Rowan Swamp Wildlife Reserve near Lake Rowan. Grasslands are usually indicated by plains or open plains. There's another one down there written on the plan. And current grasslands that exist still show remarkable agreement with these old plans. So you can see in the photograph at the bottom, you know, this area through here. I should have marked this up better, but I'm not good at this stuff. That area there is still an open grassland. That area there is, and these areas down the bottom. And in fact, that is too, but some trees have grown there along the road on high ground that was formed there. Treeless land with a diverse native ground layout and no tree stumps is very likely a natural grassland. Treeless land with stumps or depressions where trees have been removed are very likely not. Grassland ecologist Paul Foreman argues that in northeast Victoria, there are no physical features such as heavy cracking clays or frost hollows that explain the location of grasslands. There's also no difference in the floristic composition of the ground layer between grassy woodlands and natural grasslands. His conclusion is that the natural grasslands in our region are cultural artefacts that are hundreds, if not thousands of years old. The first people removed the trees and then managed these areas as vegetable gardens, maintaining them with regular digging and burning. Because active management ceased long ago, some natural grasslands have disappeared due to tree invasion. This is easy to see in the country's southeast and southwest of Nathalia. In the old days, this area had really extensive grasslands punctuated by river red gum-lined creeks and swamps. Now, there are patches of bush that consist entirely of young river red gums. There's no grey box. There are no stumps, and the only old trees are along drainage lines. These grasslands could be revived, but only if all the young trees were removed and regular burning was recommenced. The significance of natural grasslands is that they are critically endangered. We should pull out all stops to conserve them. Otherwise, don't worry about what EVC you're dealing with. It's grassy, right? And it's the grass I want you to deal with. You should definitely look after any old trees and shrubs you've already got, but don't add new ones. You will come to agree that trees and shrubs can actually be a problem for grassland management, and if you must add more, do it where the quality of the ground layer is poor and would be difficult to improve. Your second question should be, what plants have we got? Finding out will take time because not everything is visible at the same time, and the grassland will dramatically change in appearance with the seasons. Get to know it. You need to know because this information will be the key to tweaking conditions to reduce weeds, to increase the numbers of native plants, and to increase the diversity of native plants. A useful framework for organising this information is firstly, is it a weed or a native? Then the plant's life form, life history and abundance. You need to know what kind of plant they are, how long do they live, when do they grow, how do they respond to disturbances, and are there loads or just a few? I'm not going to read through that table because I reckon you can, but you get the drift. Whenever something different happens, such as a wetter than average year like this year, an erosion event, a hard frost or a fire, look again, because plant responses will give you more clues as to how you might advantage the natives over the weeds. The more characteristics you can discover for each plant, such as palatability to various grazing fauna, susceptibility to fungal attack, frost tolerance, type of bud bank or seed bank, the more options you'll be able to come up with for effective manipulation. Thirdly, you should ask, what have I got overall? There are numerous state and transition models that can be used to describe the quality or value of grassland and how degraded it is. The concept is useful because it describes what was the original undamaged state, and in this part of the world, that was mostly kangaroo grass with highly diverse forbs and many other grasses, plus a number of states of degradation. Knowing how far from the original your vegetation is helps you to understand what's possible to achieve with your interventions. An even simpler classification you can use is to ask, is it mostly weeds, or about half and half, or mostly natives? If it's mostly natives, are there unusual herbs, or is it just those that can survive after superphosphate applications such as small St John's wort, kidney weed, caustic weed, Jersey cudweed, etc.? If you have mostly weeds, you could walk away. Or if it adjoins a high quality area, or you're just obsessed or you just want to experiment, you could spray it all out and start again. My neighbour Chris Findlay, whose company Flora Victoria are experts in native grass seed production and native grass establishment, is still spraying out one of his valleys several times a year after 5 years to ensure the weed seed bank is exhausted when he finally sows it to native grasses and wildflowers. On our place, I sprayed out a valley with mostly weeds for only 2 years before sowing it to kangaroo grass. There are still some weeds, but I can boom spray with broadleaf herbicide if I need to, and I burn it each year to prevent a build-up of seed from annual weeds. As the purpose of my planting is to provide seed for sowing elsewhere, weeds without seed at harvest time, or that are well below the height of the kangaroo grass seed heads, are not really an issue for me. Another area at home where I boom sprayed dense phalaris just once, followed by a few years of spot spraying, has still got weeds, but in the absence of grazing, and 20 years later, we now have, bristly wallaby grass, white top wallaby grass, brownback wallaby grass, short wallaby grass, lobed wallaby grass, hill wallaby grass, rough spear grass, dense spear grass, kneed spear grass, feather spear grass, blown grass, and brush wire grass, which are all winter growing grasses, and windmill grass, curly windmill grass, red leg grass, common love grass, rigid panic, and kangaroo grass, which are summer growing grasses, as well as an array of common forbs. I now have a half and half situation, so I will continue to manipulate this area when I get a chance to knock out the weeds and favour the natives. If you are lucky enough to have mostly natives, regular removal of the seed of annuals and litter removal will be your main tasks, along with the removal of any perennial weeds, including new eucalypt seedlings, which, if left, will eventually outcompete your precious grasses and forbs. So, what should you do? Most grassy vegetation is riddled with weeds, choked up with biomass, and is missing many native species. To create a diverse, resilient native grass system, we need to actively intervene to reduce the weeds, reduce the biomass, reduce the nutrients in the soil, reduce the pests, and increase the diversity of native species, including the mosses, liverworts, lichen, and fungi. But how do you do it? The answer depends on what you've got and the resources that are available to you. If you have mostly weeds, you might do nothing or you might do something very dramatic. If you have mostly natives, you'll need to choose techniques that cause the least damage to the native plants and animals that live there. Tackling weeds. Every perennial weed is a native plant you're not having. They're taking up space. Weeds are usually competitive by nature and can even have allelopathic effects on plants around them by releasing toxic compounds. I recommend accurate spot spraying. Use the most effective, most selective herbicide at exactly the right time, being careful not to touch native plants. The technical knowledge required for this should not be underestimated. Always follow up, for years if necessary. Otherwise, you've simply poisoned the environment and wasted a lot of time and money. Prevent reinvasion by removing source plants from around your grassland too, especially if the seed is bird or wind dispersed. Reduce the biomass. This is all dead plant material from both natives and weeds. Removal of litter is important to prevent the death of native plants through failure to photosynthesize, to destroy harbour for invertebrate pests, to create space for new growth, and to allow for soil contact for seed germination. Annual grassy weeds are a particular problem. Annual grasses were introduced to Australia to improve pasture, along with superphosphate, because they grow fast and they're very productive. Everywhere has been grazed by stock over the years, and a certain amount of annual grass seed and extra fertiliser has been spread everywhere via manure. Native perennial plants are adapted to low levels of nutrients and sporadic rainfall. They are relatively slow growing, deep-rooted and long-lived. I think I should be on the next slide by now. Rightio. I'll just explain, this is not an exciting animal burrow. This is me kicking through to the dirt below this very thick layer of grassy biomass, annual grassy biomass. Believe it or not, under here is a high quality grassland. Where was I? So when annual grasses die off in summer, they leave a thick layer of litter lying over their abundant seed. It rapidly decomposes to provide a nutrient-rich layer that their shallow roots can access for rapid and abundant growth. They can also start growing before the natives because their shallow roots only need moisture at the soil surface. They intercept most of the moisture and quickly block out the light for the resprouting natives. If this litter is not removed, the annual grass's advantage over the natives increases over time. The litter or biomass of annuals must be constantly removed to break this downward spiral. Ideally, the seed of annual grasses should be removed too. Well-timed slashing can prevent seed set, but might have to be repeated several times in a season and does risk making litter build-up worse. Using large numbers of grazing stock for short periods when weeds are flowering and setting seed can be an effective way to prevent the build-up of annuals in native grassland. Large numbers prevents picky grazing, and short periods of grazing prevents damage to native perennials. Calves and sheep are better than cattle because they're lighter and cause less soil damage, and calves are better than sheep because they pull weeds out rather than bite them off. This technique is most useful for maintaining, as opposed to improving, extensive areas, and can be seen done well by the experienced rangers on the travelling stock reserves of the New South Wales Riverina. Burning can remove all biomass, leaving only a thin layer of ash on the soil surface until new growth commences. If none of these options are appropriate or available, you might be able to just remove the seed of annual weed, so at least the biomass is not quite as abundant next year. We're using a native grass seed harvester there to take the tops off wild oat and bearded oat. Removing the nutrients. A number of quite destructive methods for doing this have been devised, such as scalping and removing soil, mould-board ploughing to invert soil profiles, burying the weeds and nutrients beneath the surface, and repeated cropping and harvesting prior to seed set without adding fertiliser. I can only recommend scalping of sheep camps under big old trees. If all the duff and topsoil, including the added nutrients and the weed seed, are removed, scant native species usually establish on the subsoil and tree health is greatly improved. Cutting and baling and burning are less destructive methods of removing nutrients with broader application. Adding a concentrated source of carbon, such as sugar, molasses or sawdust, can theoretically remove available nitrogen by stimulating microbial activity. That's work by Suzanne Prober and Ian Lunt and others. I have not had noticeable results using sugar, and I haven't used sawdust because it would prevent soil-seed contact down the track. A promising approach, also suggested by that mob, is to introduce kangaroo grass if it's not already present. Kangaroo grass is more effective at removing nitrogen from the soil than annual grasses, and it is an effective weed suppressant. Reducing the impacts of pests and grazing. I'm not going to say much about this, except that you should think about what could be a threat and then set traps or build exclosures to find out what's causing problems. I think we massively underestimate all the eating that is going on out there all the time. Simple rabbit netting exclosures can exclude vertebrate herbivores and allow small populations of threatened species to increase to larger, more genetically diverse populations. Get advice on the most effective ways to control pests, such as slugs, red-legged earth mites, cabbage whites, and so on. And keep in mind that you'll probably have to deal with a larger environment than just your grassy patch. Never resort to pesticides. Increasing the chances of native plant germination and survival. A really exciting thing with grassland restoration is that seed and even underground buds of plants that are no longer present above the ground might still be present below. As long as we have removed the weeds, are removing biomass and nutrients, and are controlling the herbivores, we can create suitable conditions for the re-establishment of some lost species. Typical examples are the herbaceous peas, such as variable glycine, slender tick trefoil and small scurf pea, which are often missing because they're highly palatable. But they do have long-lived roots and long-lived seed still likely to be in the seed bank, and they're readily stimulated to germinate by burning. Exposure just to the chemicals in smoke breaks the dormancy in seeds of other plants like rice flowers and trigger plants. Exposure to frost, which can't happen under heavy litter, breaks dormancy for others like sweet Brassiaria. Non-vascular plants and fungi also seem to be advantaged by fire. Introducing seed if it's absent. While most native plants don't rely on germination for persistence, we will want new native plants to establish in the spaces left by the weeds we have removed. One way to prevent weeds recolonising bare areas is to plant a tree. Young eucalypts suppress most ground layer plants. If we don't have much time, this can be a good stopgap. A better thing to do is harvest seed of quick colonisers from other parts of the grassland, especially grasses, because we can treat them with broadleaf herbicides when they're reinvaded by weeds, and we can sow that into bare patches. We can also harvest the seed from the unusual plants, bulking it up in the nursery over a few years. You getting that funny sound? Nope, okay. Where are we? Yeah, we can bulk up the seed of unusual plants and then sow that back into areas that are lacking in diversity but otherwise weed-free, if we want.
We have about 5 minutes. 5 minutes,
Okay.
Sally.
Wow, I've got a bit to go. All right. Okay. I have to say, I find burning is the most useful technique for grassland maintenance because it can achieve so many things if it is applied in the right way at the right time. It can remove all the dead material. It can remove weed seed, stimulate native seed to germinate, leave nutrients in a form suited to native plants, destroy the eggs or larvae of some pest species, destroy rust and mildew spores, expose mouse warrens to predators, give galahs and cockies access to onion grass bulbs, provide a suitable substrate for mosses, lichens and fungi, and much more besides. Because our grasslands were created and maintained by fire, using fire by Indigenous ancestors, it also makes sense that grassland flora and fauna we now have would be adapted to it. We have much to learn from contemporary Indigenous fire practitioners such as Victor Stephenson and others, and we should all support full access to country for Indigenous Australians to practice cultural burning. My hope is that we can learn best how to use fire together. I would like to pass on just a few tips based on what I've learnt so far about burning. A burn in autumn after the first rains have dampened the soil and germinated some of the weed seed, but on a day when the dry matter is dry, is a good time to burn to kill germinated annuals, seed held high on weeds, seed on top of the litter, and to remove the litter. The cracks in the ground are still open for fauna to escape into. Native perennials respond with vigour and some native seed germinates depending on the weather that follows. An autumn burn leaves resprouting perennials very exposed and very vigorous. Even by the time weeds such as Patterson's curse or flatweed are ready to be sprayed, they can still be much more easily seen and accurately sprayed. Burning makes spot spraying of perennial weeds fast, effective and accurate. Where perennial weeds are impossible to get out of natives, a small burn at the right time can remove the foliage of the native, allowing you to spot spray the weed leaves when they re-emerge first. Cool burns can kill eucalypt seedlings only up to about a year old. Older seedlings need hotter fires. Straw or branches can be heaped onto weeds like paspalum, and you can kill them with a hotter burn. Kangaroo grass is very flammable and can be burnt any time. You can see these girls are wearing puffer jackets, very cold. Winter burn has a low impact and can be good for just removing dead material. If weed control is the priority, burn everything out to the dirt of the road or the bare paddock or the short mown grass. Do not leave strips of seeding weeds because they will be blown onto the burnt area to be the first to germinate after the burn. Litter and duff under big old trees can and should be burnt to allow the growth of forbs and grasses. It doesn't burn well, however, and it's easy to accidentally burn roots and buried timber, and fires can restart after weeks. The best time would probably be in winter or spring when the soil underneath is as damp as it can be, but the duff has just begun drying out. Raking well around the trunk, burning small areas at a time, thoroughly wetting afterwards and being able to check often afterwards are all advisable. I have so much more to learn about managing grassy ground cover, so I will keep doing what seems to work and I'll keep trying new things in new places with new people. To sum up, always keep in mind what you're trying to achieve, getting rid of the weeds, reducing the biomass, removing the nutrients, controlling the pests and getting more natives growing. How you choose to do things depends completely on what you have. Get advice from other managers, from pest or weed contractors, from the scientific literature, but then give it a go. Observe everything you can and you find you will learn from doing. If you keep wondering and wondering. Thank you.
Thanks, Sally. Unless there's a quick question, we'll move on to the next presentation. But Sally will join us for the discussion session at 12.
Okay.
Can you mute yourself, Sally? Thank you. And we now have Marie Gilbert from Canberra Parks and Conservation, who has had 10 years' experience in managing grasslands in the ACT. Welcome, Marie.
Good morning. Thank you very much.
Okay, you sharing your screen or?
Yep, I will do now.
Okay, so welcome Marie Gilbert from the ACT.
Thank you very much. You did a great job of introducing the grasslands. I will get a little bit of that as the doing part of it. Can you see my screen?
We can see the slide, but it's not on full screen.
You got my screen up with the right my presentation. It's time to come up. Hang on a sec, I'll try it again. The alternative, as well as if you guys run the presentation, if it doesn't look like it at all on the screen.
Yes, I think we can run the presentation. And I guess if you just call next when you want it moved on.
Sure. Okay.
And the audio's better now as well. So.
Okay.
It's just
You're welcome.
Just a coincidence of issues at our end. So if you just pause for a second. Right, we're plugged in now.
If she hasn't turned her video off, get her to turn her video off because that'll be some ban.
Okay. And we'll just do an audio test. You could turn your video off to improve your audio, Marie.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Thanks.
Okay, we have your first slide up now, so you can start the commentary. Thanks.
Great. Okay. I can't see it, which is really odd, but it doesn't matter. We'll go through anyway. I'm not fairly back to front. So thanks for inviting me to talk about the grasslands restoration. We've done quite a bit of work here in the ACT. ACT Parks has been actively managing their grassland remnants for 20 years now. Oh, there we go. Now I can see it. We've done some additional investment recently as we've had many new reserves added to the estate through the environmental offsets process. Next. Can you make that full screen, or is that what I'm seeing, or I can't tell?
It's full screen for us, so you can continue.
Great, excellent. Okay. So we've got, I think Sally covered the why grasslands pretty well. Here in the ACT, they're pretty special. Parks and Conservation Services manages in excess of 3,000 hectares of grasslands in various condition. It's pretty much rare, the southern tablelands these days, so there's less than 1% of natural temperate grasslands left. And we found here in the ACT, there's a huge diversity of flora and fauna. So they're pretty special to us, as they are to Victorians as well, I know. Grassland management is all about maintaining the sweet spot. Sorry, next slide. Grasslands management is all about maintaining the sweet spot both from a biodiversity and a fire fuel management perspective. Grass obviously rapidly responds to environmental conditions, and without some means of removing the grass growth, ecosystem function declines and the fire hazard increases. And that's particularly relevant as you know, for the larger land managers, because there's a lot of pressure often put on us for fire management. Our highest diversity grasslands occurs when the grass height is between at about the 5 and the 15 centimetres. That's the sweet spot for most flora and fauna. And they've evolved under a fire and grazing regime, which regulates that grass growth. But since colonisation and since a lot of government or private land management has taken over, a lot of those management processes have changed. So as land managers, we saw it was our job to facilitate the reintroduction of some of these processes in our remnant patches on Canberra's doorstep. I have to also point out that kangaroo is a really integral part of this process, and I'll speak to that a little bit more soon. Next, please. So the role of fire, we know that fire's obviously been around for a very long time, used by humans for thousands of years, and it was used by our Ngunnawal people to attract herbivores, both to maintain quality and condition of the grass and also for hunting purposes. We've got some of the largest, highest quality and best connected natural temperate grassland remnants left. We also manage grasslands of vastly different qualities, from high quality natural temperate grasslands. So I heard Sally talking about the different types of grassland communities in Victoria. I think ours is called natural temperate grasslands of the southern tablelands, which is very similar. There's a lot of overlap between what you guys have and a lot of the species you guys have and what we have as well. There's a lot of wildflowers, and then we also have a lot of native pastures dominated by 1 or 2 species. Right through to the spectrum of areas that are monoculture or phalaris-dominated, whole paddocks. So the reason Parks and Conservation started on a project to understand the use of fire and the way we can use fire in our landscapes was to improve our understanding of how we can improve biodiversity, increase resilience to our invasives, and up here, our most serious invasives for concern for grasslands is African lovegrass and Serrata tussock, and also reduce the fire risk, this perceived fire risk that long grass has to the community. Next, please. So I'll just quickly run through what we started about 10 years ago. So we're well and truly into this process of application and understanding. So we wanted to reintroduce a fire regime to these grassland reserves. The history of them was that they'd mostly been grazed before they were nature reserves, and we wanted to be able to re-establish a more natural management. We also wanted to improve them. So we had to test how fire would be best applied in these particular situations. So we've got spring and autumn treatments, we've got high, moderate and low quality grassland. And so what I wanted to do today is share with you what we've learned so far and to encourage everybody to have confidence to go forward. Next, please. So this one is an example of one particular nature reserve, and I just wanted to give you an idea of how we sort of divvied it up. Some of the timings had to change, of course, because you can't burn wet grass, despite what a lot of people would like us to do. You just can't. And so what we did is basically divvied up different treatments. They're all at about the 10 hectare scale. So that's something else that some of these, our reserves vary from 20 hectare grasslands to 400 hectare grasslands. And we wanted to undertake a program that was landscape scale, that wasn't just about burning small patches, but was to enable us to start this rotational sort of cycle of burning. So you can see that's how we sort of divided up a reserve. We've modified it since then. Next, please. And underpinning this whole thing was that if we can't learn from what we're doing, then obviously, and share it with others, then, you know, it's a really missed opportunity. So ACT Government, and particularly the Environment and Planning Directorate, has made a commitment to adaptive management. And I know there's a lot of discussion out there about what adaptive management means. And what we wanted to do is have a go at it and apply some fairly reasonable experimental design and monitoring so that we could determine some of the key learnings from this process. Next, please. Now, the way we measured change or response to fire was quite sophisticated. I can't recommend undertaking such an extensive program again, but certainly at the time we've made a really good investment for everybody else to benefit from. So just to give you an idea, out of those 7 reserves, we had 320 monitoring plots established. We had both plant diversity, so diversity and abundance, and then we also looked at structure. So we wanted to know how, you know, obviously, what are the triggers perhaps for fire to be applied in the landscape. We also were looking at fauna response because primarily the grasslands are home to a lot of threatened fauna and also some threatened insects as well. So we're really interested to know and to be able to prove to the community that the ecological burning was not going to have an impact on our threatened species. And bird surveys too, because that was really important. Next, please. So to date, and I'm missing a year out of this, but I just want to give you an idea. We've done more than 30 burns, more than 300 hectares. We've applied burns from September through to May, which is what the Ngunnawal people and the species composition suggests is the ideal time to apply. We've monitored 1,702 vegetation quadrants at 140 different locations, identified 310 different plant species. So this program has also been an opportunity to increase our knowledge of the plant diversity and turn 17,000 tiles. So we use roof tiles as our reptile monitoring method. Next, please. So the other thing we've really achieved, and this is, you know, something that perhaps can't be measured, but has had a profound impact on ACT Parks and the Canberra community, is we've increased our capacity, skills and knowledge to undertake these burns safely within prescription. We understand the prescription, we understand what are key parts to preserve. So it has been a steep learning curve, and you can see here some of the things that we've considered, you know, that the ash bed, one of the functions of doing a fire is at the ash bed. There's lots of benefits from the ash bed. So, you know, don't drive all over it and don't put water all over it. You want to ensure that, you know, the way of doing a hazard reduction burn is to keep fire in a box. So you light the entire outside of the box and let it burn inwards. In this instance, that does not allow fauna to escape. So, you know, we had to modify the ways we would light up a grassland burn. And the other thing it's done is put smoke within the urban area fairly frequently. It's been low scale, low risk, low pollution levels, and I hope it's increased community confidence that this burning, you know, there's something other than hazard reduction. This burning is enormously beneficial to the biodiversity, and it occurs as part of our daily work practices. It's not a special thing that's done occasionally. It just happens normally. It's a normal management tool for the Parks and Conservation Service. Next, please. So just a summary of also what we've learned, the findings that we've had in the flora is that 140 different locations. We've got mostly native, but there are a lot of exotics. There's almost half and half. And we've also identified really key hotspots, areas that obviously the history of land management hasn't been too disruptive, and we've got an extraordinary diversity in 1 square metre. That's 50 different species just in 1 square metre. So as Sally said before, grasslands are enormously productive and diverse. Next, please. The other thing we've done is, you know, we've learned a lot about the fauna that occur in grasslands. We don't have the small mammals that we know of anymore in our grasslands, but we do have a lot of reptiles and amphibians and insects too. So we've increased our knowledge of that. Two of these two are threatened. The grassland, the Canberra grassland illustrator, is critically threatened, critically endangered now. So this program started out of a need to improve the way we manage grasslands, specifically for that Canberra grassland illustrator. Next, please. So we're not completely finished. We are still collecting 5 years since burning data. So we wanted to track change across the perception of, you know, the growth and development of a community from nothing through to maturity. We thought it was about 5 years. And we've used it to really try and understand how the ecosystem has responded to the burning. You can see here some of the variables that we've considered. And I'm going to share a snapshot of the results that we have so far. And of course, when this is all finished, it will be written up and shared as much as we can. Next, please. So this is some of the plant data that we've got, the flora. So from a plant community perspective, the good news is that overall fire had a positive effect on our grassland communities, with high quality grasslands benefiting the most. So there was change in all, but where there was greatest diversity existing, we got a greater response. So, and that, you know, is really not surprising. It's certainly what we hoped for, but it's not surprising. Basically, if you make space, things will grow. Next, please. But we noticed that the results varied according to the herbage mass, so the amount of material, and the thatch depths. And the way in which we applied fire, such as the total area burned and the level of consumption of fuels, also would influence the results on the flora. So the take-home message here, though, is that we saw a loss of native species, even though we saw a loss of native species richness at one site initially, it had recovered and has recovered even more since we've collected these results. So not surprisingly, burn everything, the species richness takes time for different things to respond, but it has responded well and actually increased. So we've also, since we started this, we've gone into that protracted no rain. It wasn't even a drought. We just didn't rain for nearly 12 months straight. So, you know, that has impacted on recovery and also made us rethink about applying burns when there's no moisture in the profile, in the soil profile, that enables the flora and even the fauna to recover from burning. So we put everything on hold throughout that period. Some good news, was that the results for fauna was similar, and I know I'm showing, lots of information on the screen, but the take-home message here is that when we applied fire to an area where those Canberra grassland lizard dragon had not been recorded for several years in a row, the dragons reappeared. They recolonised the area because it had opened up, the dense grass mass and made it more easy for them to live in and to forage in and all that kind of stuff. The other important thing is that although striped legless lizards showed an initial decline in the burnt area, and that's because we'd removed all the cover, their numbers had recovered and in fact increased recovered by the 2-year mark, and at the 4-year mark have actually increased. Next, please. So we're just going to flick through these quickly to see how dynamic these grassland systems are and how quickly they recover. So this was in March 2016, just before we did the first burn at Mulungali grasslands, and that's habitat of the striped legless lizard. As you can see, there's quite high biomass. There was a bit of thatch, but it was consistent and it was very cured. Next, please. So this is the day after we burnt, and as you can see, whilst the whole site the fire has been applied to the whole site, there's a variation in the consumption of fuels. There was a lot of discussion about patchiness and how to achieve patchiness, and we had to start to understand how fire moved across the landscape and what was left behind afterwards. So there's a big, there's a lot to unpack when we talk about patchiness within a burn area. Next, please. So then you can see by spring, we've had a really good response by the vegetation, but structurally it's still really low. Next, please. A month later, everything's rapidly greening up and returning. Next, please. This is November 2016. We've got structure. It's a lot of the C4, the summer-grown grasses are starting to respond. And then a full year later, it's back looking almost the same as it did. Sorry, next screen. It's looking almost as good as it did before we started, except what we found is there's no thatch and there's greater intertussock spaces, which are really important for the diversity of flora and for the diversity of fauna too. Next, please. So what we've learned is fire is most beneficial where habitat quality has declined. So I referred to before to if you apply it to a high quality grassland and that grassland has become rank and overgrown and is reduced in its quality and its floristic composition, then you'll get a really positive high response. Also thatch, which is, we've realised thatch, excessive amounts of thatch, so dead grass lying over on the ground and not decomposing, is actually one of the most significant threatening processes to a grassland. If you let a grassland senesce and end up with nothing but thatch, it completely smothers itself out and nothing can grow and develop. So we use thatch as a trigger now to understand when we want to apply burning. And if there's low native species richness and a high exotic annual grasses, particularly black oats, it's a really effective way to manage black oats if you can burn in spring, which is a challenge, and the opportunity only comes infrequently. And the most important thing is that we wanted a really slow rate of spread of the fire. This is fire speak now. And we want a high level of fuel consumption. So we want the grass, we want the thatch to burn. If your target fuel is thatch, we want good burning consumption of that thatch. Next, please. But something we also noticed was that tall spear grass, so that's a C4 stiper, Ostrostiper, mostly Ostrostiper bigeniculata, it actually declined. And so we've kind of put together a conclusion that fire will reduce diversity of C3, winter growing grasses. But the flip side of that is that what we get in place of those C3 grasses is more C4 grasses and more native C4 grasses. So you've got to be really clear about why you're applying fire and what you're trying to achieve. In the short term, some exotic plants may increase. And so you need to be aware that when you apply fire, you've created a bare open ground. And if you've got a high weed load in the surrounding areas, then you might have a big weed load response. We are trying, so when we get the 5th year of data in, there's been some work done by Ken Hodgkinson here in the ACT, and he's suggesting that fire also has a significant effect on the soil chemistry, and that there's a flip at about the 3 to 4 year mark where instead of becoming exotic dominated, a burnt patch becomes native dominated. And that's pretty significant for restoration purposes, a way of taking a grassland that, you know, has perhaps got more exotic species than native and being able to, you know, reinstate a higher native species dominance. And the other thing that's really important is that obviously if you remove habitat of the fauna that's within the burn area, the fauna are going to have to leave if they're not already picked off by predatory birds and other things before you finish the burn. So we've noticed a lot of raptors hovering over the burn, picking things off. So if you're applying burn and your fauna species are, you know, dunnarts or something like that, make sure that within the burn area, if it's large, if it occupies most of the dunnarts territory, that you maintain an unburnt patch or an unburnt log or whatever their particular habitat niche is. Next, please. So I would recommend that, I would suggest that what we've learned so far and what I've alluded to already is that burns really need to meet site-specific management objectives. You need to know what the result of the fire will be before you apply the fire. You don't put the fire in and then go, whoops, which sounds really obvious, but hazard reduction burns are applied to reduce the amount of grass sitting there, you know, that could catch fire in wildfire. Ecological burns, you have an ecological outcome, and knowing it's to open up the intertussock spaces, reduce the thatch, you know, provides, you know, seeding and flowering of the native plants. You know, they're some of the objectives that we use. Obviously, fire is a great way to reduce tussock growth, thatch, and those exotic annual grasses, those spring-growing grasses like wild oats. We would obviously, to create a cool burning situation, which is what the Ngunnawal people recommend, is that we use a backing fire, that we know your target fuel. So if your fuel is thatch, then you apply fire in a way that thatch will be consumed. So you want it to move really slowly and it has the time. The thatch is cured, the thatch is dry enough that it will burn. If you're targeting grass tussocks, the thatch doesn't matter. The fire can move a bit quicker, will probably consume the grass tussocks, and the thatch will be left sitting on the ground. The thatch then decomposes much quicker, but it's just different types of fire. My experience in Canberra, because of the composition of our grasses, is that we don't even bother showing up if the relative humidity is not going to drop below 50. You're just putting too much artificial incendiaries into the system and trying to force things to burn. Use your environmental conditions to help take the fire through. A little bit of wind, relative humidity below 50, and it will run itself very, very nicely. And you get your cool burn, your patchiness, your consumption, everything. And something to consider, which we probably learned coming into that period with no rain in 18 and 19, is that you need to think about the system's recovery. You need to consider whether the conditions will be right for the plants that you've applied fire to recover afterwards. So if you're in a protracted drought, if there is no moisture in the profile, it's probably not a good idea to put fire in, because you might find that the plants that you want to grow struggle and new colonisers come in and change the floristic composition. Next, please. So this is a graphical representation of what I was talking about before, about being at 5 to 10 centimetres. A colleague of this, Brett Howland, put this together, and it's a fabulous reference to understand sort of the different fauna that use grasslands at different heights and approximately where you'd use fire. So we're talking about, you know, when the grass starts to get to 20 centimetres, there's going to start to be a deposition of thatch. You're going to lose your intertussock spaces, and that's probably the time you apply fire. Next, please. Okay, this one is a little video of, so you'll have to tell me, so if you click on the video, then press play, it should work for you, but it's just an example of one of our burns and how it was moving. This is back in flame, just crawling through a C3, so a stiper-dominated grassland, but with patches of Themata, so we wanted to make it more balanced. Does that work for you?
Yep.
Great. Tell me when it's done and we can go to the next one. So just while you're watching this, you can see that the fire doesn't consume everything, and we've been able to walk through this landscape because it's cool, it's got a low flame height, a low rate of spread, it's consuming the really dry stuff. There's little patches that didn't burn. We can walk over one of these burnt areas, and I love how our Indigenous people talk to putting fire into the country when it's ready, and their PPE is often thongs because they can feel the temperature of the flame and they can, you know, walk across the burnt area after it's done. And this is very similar. There's very little heat in it. And so what we discovered is that most of the critters survive. We haven't found much mortality in skinks and dragons and even insects. It's surprising, you know, the wolf spiders are all out and crawling straight afterwards. So that's really interesting. Has it finished?
Yep, and we've got a minute or two left.
Yep, second last slide. So if you're wondering, you know, you've got a grassland patch and how you go about applying fire, is that we would recommend it's a great way to manage biomass because biomass, you know, builds up so very rapidly. But we've also noticed that applying fire can move your kangaroos around the landscape. So it's a great way. Some of the research done shows that kangaroos are really picky about the stage of growth of grass. And if you want to keep kangaroos within an area to eat grass, you're going to have to do some sort of active management, and fire is a good way of offering them green pick. It has got application to restoring grasslands, but it can't be used everywhere for everything. You need to consider what you have and what you're trying to achieve. And I just included this great state and transition model from the Journal of Botany recently, and it talks about understanding what you've got and where you want it to go. And you can see that C3 grassland and that shift from C4 to C3 dominance is actually going backwards, and you can increase that with fire. So that's where fire comes in. Next slide. Just a little friend of mine. And I just want to say thanks for the opportunity today, and I'm happy to hang around and answer some questions about how we've applied fire, the details, some of the data. Yeah, thanks.
Great, thanks Marie. We might have one question from Marie while we ask Ben and Graham to come up and join for the discussion session.
Hi, my question is, what was the overall response from the community when you started burning near settlements and near highly urbanized areas?
That's a good question. So the process of being able to undertake a burn requires a whole system of notifications that start 2 weeks out. So we're not very spontaneous in the way we apply fire. But within that 24 hours, we're very sure that we engage with the community. If we're burning up to people's back fence, we'll letterbox drop and we'll also make sure that we have a person on site that can talk people through what we're doing and why we're doing it. These days, so that was early on when there was a lot of interest, and you know, we've got to really be mindful of smoke and air quality, you know, in Canberra, and I'm sure everywhere. You know, there's a lot of health issues out there. And progressively what we've found now is that people barely notice. When you burn grass, generally, the smoke is pretty clean. It doesn't have a great presence. And the 10 hectares, you know, some of the burning that's done up in the mountains can be 1,000 hectares. It can be burning a lot of leaf and, you know, timber and woody debris, and it puts up big plumes of smoke. Grassland burning, hardly anybody notices, and provided you've done your public notifications, generally there's a really positive response. And, you know, people often want to come along and have a chat about what you're doing. You know, they're really interested. We do one on the weekend. The whole suburb turns out to have a chat, find out what we're doing, and then we'll often offer talks and, you know, community walks through these areas so that people can see how it's used. But it's pretty positive these days, but it's been 10 years in the making. I am a lot greyer now than when I started, I can tell you that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Mary.
I've just got a really quick one, Marie. When you measured the height of the grassland, did you exclude the flowering stems, or did you average out the height of the
Yes,
vegetation?
we excluded the flowering stems. So
Oh, okay.
I can send you the monitoring, the methodology. But yeah, no, we didn't include the height of the flowering stems.
Okay.
And we've rolled that into ongoing monitoring as to help with the adaptive management about where we apply burns each year. We review spring data and make a decision on that. So it's, yeah, but it's that average stem height, not including the flowering stems.
Okay, thanks.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Marie, that was fascinating. Thank you very much. You mentioned that fire affects soil chemistry, and that after 3 to 4 years, native species started to dominate after a burn. Was that after a single burn or after repeated burning for 3 to 4 years?
Yep, good question. Really good question. So Ken Hodgkinson's done some preliminary work. I'll turn my video off if it's making the audio terrible. So it's after the first application of burning. So that is a really good question, because each of these burns, we're looking for the right environmental triggers to apply burning, and we figured out that that is a combination of grass height and thatch. And so here in Canberra, we don't get that build up for between 5 and 10 years. Victorian Themata communities are very, very different. But a lot of the communities that they've done that research in are highly modified, contain a lot of phalaris and a lot of other things that, you know, the exotic perennial grasses that they're trying to flip. So, and it also is interesting because when you first apply a burn in a grassland area, that first year we've had obviously a lot more rainfall this year, and the response from last year's autumn burnings was almost 100% plantain response. And people were very nervous and very worried and were thinking about whether they need to apply chemicals and all that kind of stuff to wipe out these non-desirable species. And what we're hoping to demonstrate in this bigger scale experiment is that after the 4 or 5 year point, there's no need to control those exotics that colonise a newly burnt area, that there's something within the soil chemistry that flips and shows more favourable conditions for the natives to grow.
Okay, well, we're approaching the end of the session, but we might open up to all the speakers if there are any questions you'd like to direct to particular speakers or a general question across the board. So I think Suzanne and Dennis, and then Mark, and then Wes.
I had one which is probably for Marie. Hi Marie, I'm Suzette. I'm from a Western Melbourne council where we have some remnant plains grassland left. And we've got a plot. We've got a remnant site that's probably about 30 metres by sort of 200 metre linear kind of strip, and we've been trying to burn yearly, but as you say, the logistical problems with burns doesn't always work. Usually autumn burns, but we've been doing them in mosaics of 20 by about 20 by 20 metres kind of thing. And I believe that was planned without me, but I believe that was because we were letting animals escape. We have some cool tussock skinks there. We haven't unfortunately found any striped legless lizards, although we do have them in other areas in the municipality. But I wonder, from what you said, it sounds like perhaps we should consider maybe burning that entire area, because the animals do actually have neighbouring areas that we don't manage, but they can escape to. They're unmanaged grassland with a bit of kikuyu running through and, things like that.
I think that the way you've approached it is probably the sensible way. The rough calculation that we have moved on with is 10%, that we burn 10% of a reserve per year, and in a cycle that we move around, so that there's always a heterogeneity of grass heights and recovering, flora for the different species to occupy. I think, depending on your fire regime, if you try and burn it annually, because I know Victorians, you have so much fuel, it's so exciting, but you might divide that sort of linear thing into 3, and you've got one that's, if it's likely to require burning every 3 years, you'd have one unburnt, one that was burnt last year or the year before, and one that's freshly burnt. So you always got that, differentiation. If you remember the grass height diagram, that across that whole site, you're offering the fauna and even the flora a huge variation in, grass height and tussock, space between tussocks. Does that help?
Thank you, yes.
Dennis?
Marie and Sally both mentioned briefly insects, but in the whole 2 days, we've shown a lot of concern and empathy for all other creatures. I'm just wondering, what is the significance of insects in all of this ecological renewal? It's sort of a naive question to anybody that wants to have a go, but it just intrigued me that nobody's really talked about it.
Well, so I don't have much else to play with. I've got a legless lizard, an earless dragon, and a mouthless moth. So I don't really have, exciting mammals. But what we're learning with this grassland earless dragon, because its population has so rapidly declined over the last 5 years, is that there's a whole community of insects that are a significant fauna, a part of the fauna of the grasslands, and they're poorly studied, and we're trying to improve our understanding. They are the food source of the grassland earless dragons and the striped legless lizards. But the other thing we noticed, that we've got so much grassland with so much growth that's gone really rank, and we've noticed that the ant populations drop off, and then the dragons eat the ants. But if the grasslands aren't producing seed, particularly if the grasses aren't producing seed, we're thinking that the ants move on. So there's quite, we're just starting to wind up an understanding of some of the invertebrates and how we also might manipulate or reintroduce those invertebrates. The grassland earless dragon lives in burrows in the soil, and those burrows, I think, are created by the Canberra raspy cricket, but they're maintained and enhanced by wolf spiders. So in this community of grasslands, our fauna is tied very, very closely with the invertebrate community.
Mark?
I would also just add that, logic tells you that if we can make our grasslands more diverse and encourage the growth of herbs, we're going to be able to support more invertebrates. you know, obvious examples are some of the small blue butterflies that love to eat those herbaceous peas. Yeah, I don't know much about insects, but I do know when I go into an area with a healthy ground layer, I see all sorts of weird and wonderful things I don't see anywhere else. The other thing I would say is we're in quite a lot of trouble in northern Victoria because we've had this huge transition from grazing to cropping over the last 20 years. And of course, you know, croppers apply pesticides to crops and they grow crops like canola that attract cabbage white butterflies. So, yeah, we just simply have to do the best we can do to create really good habitat. Yeah.
Yeah, it's Mark Backman from Nature Glenelg Trust. Fantastic presentations this morning. I'm curious whether anyone has had any, and thinking about the wetland theme that sort of sits behind this forum, grasslands often surround or overlap with wetland features. Have any of the speakers had any experience with either the restoration methods or with the use of fire in grasslands that actually extend into, you know, wet meadows, some of our shallow wetlands, and any observations about what you've encountered when you've tried to interact with wetter grassy systems?
I would like to be able to apply fire to our wetter grassy systems, but we're unable to do that on public land in northeast Victoria.
We've probably done a bit of that through the stewardship project. So we've got our grasslands on private land where we're doing burning, but we've also got all these seasonal herbaceous wetlands. And a lot of those are dominated by glyceria. And I reckon the dynamics of glyceria-dominated wetlands play out in a lot of ways very similar to the Thermida grasslands. We're seeing that build up of thatch. And so we've burnt those areas. We see that thatch clear out and just get this amazing flush of things like billy buttons and microceras popping up in those seasonal wetlands after a burn. So I think there is definitely a role of fire, particularly in those grassy systems. Maybe not so much in the herb-dominated areas that really kind of all shrivel up and dry up in summer, and maybe you don't have the biomass to carry a fire through those. But the grassy ones, I reckon fire plays a role.
So I guess the catch would be timing as well, because you've got a narrower window of time to actually put fire in those and keeping out of a time of year when people think risk.
Yeah, so they've been burnt in sort of late summer, autumn, once the wetlands are completely dry. We've been able to get a burn go through. Yeah.
We've done some burning at Jerrabomba wetlands here, and the objective was to reintroduce fire, like natural fire, managed fire into the wetlands. But we're managing vast areas just covered in phalaris, and we've done it again on that, patches and working our way around. And we've done about 7 or 8 patches, one each year. It's one of the first ones to go, probably August, September, because we burn off the dead standing material based on the Indigenous, the Ngunnawal people. They recommended that you apply fire to the dead standing stuff above water. So you've got to have water because the water protects the veg underneath, burns off all the stuff at the top. And we've noticed that fire has been able to reduce the overwhelming biomass smothering effect of the non-native species and actually encourage some of the native sedges and some of the other native water plants. So we actually burn over the swamp and it's encouraged more of the natives to reappear. It also has, the timing of it, I'm not the expert of that burning, but the timing of it's been really important for turtles and for turtles to emerge and lay their eggs. So there's been this link between, not only improving the quality of vegetation, but also enabling the fauna to move through for their life cycle as well. So it's been really effective up here, burning over water.
It's funny you should say that, because I'm aware of a number of public land sites where unfortunately both the burning and the grazing were removed together when land management changed. So we haven't been able to disentangle those two things, and often what's seen as a decline in vegetation health because the people who were maybe grazing these areas were burning them to keep the fresh pick coming. And now we've got this problem that both of those things stopped at the same time, and you've had this long period of of a habitat transition in the absence of that biomass removal. So yeah, that fits with what I've certainly seen. My follow-up question was about, thinking about what you said, Sally, all of the grassy woodlands that we've lost as a result of them shrubbing up and treeing up, and has anybody experimented with returning some of our now shrubby or heathy woodlands through repeated burning and to try and return them to a more grassy structure? Because there's certainly lots of places in the landscape that have gone through that transition.
Not yet. Yeah, but now that we've got this grassland program accepted both by the bureaucracy and the community, our next step is into woodlands, and it's with the focus. I love how Sally said, they're grassy woodlands. We focus on the grass bit. We don't want to burn the trees, so we've got to be very careful about how we apply fire and where we apply fire. But if it ever stops raining, my first burns will be in these yellow box Blakely Eyes woodlands, and it's because they've been long time since fire. They've basically got no acacias, no understory apart from the Uke region, and in many cases, there's very poor quality ground cover, and so we want to experiment with fire in there. But that's a wait to be seen. The risk there is that the trees, some of those trees are a couple of 100 years old. You've got to be so careful, and so we've just taken a little bit longer to ensure we knew what we were doing and what we were targeting, rather than just applying fire and letting it trickle through the landscape.
Okay, last question from Wes before we have a wrap up from our CEO, Sue.
Hi, Wes Ward from Charles Sturt University here. Great presentations from everyone today. And there's a little underlying theme I sort of noticed at various levels was the use of Indigenous knowledge that's being incorporated into people's various work. And I'm just wondering how easy or difficult it was to get that. I could imagine somewhere like Canberra it might have been a little bit easier, given some of the impetus over the years with the Ngunnawal people. But I'm wondering, in other landscapes, particularly across Victoria, how easy that's been able to get and what sort of sources people have used, thinking of not only just current traditional owners, but also stories that have been recorded by people like early explorers and early records from stations, from squatter stations and that. So over to you, just some comments, any comment about that would be great. Thank you.
Yep.
Go on.
Okay. Yeah, so certainly with, I think pretty much all the biodiversity projects we run at Glenelg Hopkins, we partner with the traditional owners in those areas. And usually, particularly with these current grassland projects, the starting point was supporting the traditional owner groups with developing a lit review, so they can put together all of that knowledge, both that knowledge from European explorers, but their own oral history and traditional knowledge. And they own that, but that is helping them to inform the way that they approach, the way that they work in our projects. To date, it's been around burning. So with grasslands, particularly with Wadawurrung, we've been able to get a couple of burns both on public land and private land, but we certainly would like to do more things to do with plan establishment techniques. But a lot of it is probably also providing an opportunity to let them sort of decide what they want to do and where they want to take things, rather than it coming from us saying, we want this area burnt, can you guys come and burn this? So that's kind of where we started, but we can see that changing as these TO groups, as they building confidence, capacity, actually taking the lead on this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, look, I would also say in our part of the world, a lot of knowledge has been lost, mostly because of Indigenous people being suburbanised. They don't have access to land generally, with the exception of, the river forests. So I'm guessing they're often a little bit confronted by our desire to learn about traditional burning, because, a lot of Indigenous people want to practice burning as a cultural and spiritual caring for the land. but might not be in a position to talk to white fellas about exactly what should be done or how to do it. That said, you know, they're working away on that amongst their communities. The sort of formal opportunities for participation are incredibly limited. We have a problem in the sense that our government only recognises the Yorta Yorta people. It doesn't, and that doesn't give opportunities to others in the community that identify differently or don't feel part of that community or aren't invited to participate. So it's complicated. And DELP themselves in our region are only kind of just beginning to acknowledge that allowing Indigenous people to participate in burning might be a good idea. And they're very far at this point in time from letting that happen. We've got a long way to go.
Yeah,
Okay.
I back both of those. I understand that, you know, Canberra is a little bit different, but I'm a little bit further down the track. And my comment would be that we started this process together. We started trying to incorporate cultural opportunities for the Ngunnawal people, and they have decided that also because of the rules and regulation that this part, as a public land manager, we have to meet, that the cultural burns and ecological burns, whilst they might produce a similar result to the flora and fauna, they're completely different things. A cultural burn is for Ngunnawal people on Ngunnawal land. And what we do is they've shared some of their knowledge in terms of the timing, some of the indicators, and suggested that we don't get out drip torches. And we're evolving our techniques from that. But more recently, they've said, actually, there's no partnership in cultural burning. Cultural burning is our practice. It's a practice that we want to do for our people, and it doesn't involve telling government agencies what to do and then let you do it for us. That's just missing the point entirely. So we've worked quite closely. We have identified fire management officers. We've got a Murrumbung Ranger network, and at every opportunity, we give them the chance to join us and to light. We've had a few elders light up, you know, a few different burns, and it's evolved to the point where they're saying, yeah, we understand that you need to do this burning, and we agree that your burning for country is valuable for the plants and animals, but it is not cultural burning, and we will do the cultural burning when we're ready to do it. So yeah, hopefully that's it.
Okay, I'm mindful that lunch is served, and perhaps we could carry that on as a thought for a future forum, perhaps. But I'll hand over to Sue or Lance. To Sue to provide a wrap-up on the day's proceedings and the forum in general.
Thanks, Peter. I'm here on behalf of the Winton Wetlands. I'd just like to say thank you. This has been an amazing 2 days. As everyone has been saying, this is fascinating, and it is. You sit there. I'm not a ecologist or anything like that. I'm just a manager, but you learn so much from days like these. The three main themes were rewilding of iconic species, and hopefully we'll be able to do that in the next 6 months. Communities of practice for restoration, and we're linking in those. It's shown how you people get together, you link with each other, you share knowledge. It's amazing. And the grassland management, which we've got a lot of, and we're learning, but we'll get there. Now, it's a big thank you to all the presenters, to everyone that's been here, presented, but also the ones that have been via Zoom. And we appreciate everyone's time and effort to get here and to be part of this. It's such an amazing place, and it's really good to see such dedicated, passionate people, and It's from researchers, it's the community, it's industry-based organisations. It's not just the select few. It's everyone working together. And if we work together and share that knowledge, we'll be streets ahead. And next year, hopefully, we'll be able to get a lot more people here, and we'll be able to involve a lot more walking around outside as well. Okay, just thank you to everyone, but the big thanks is to Lance and to Karen, who have organised this and pulled it together. Without this, it wouldn't happen. So thank you to both of these people, and I ask you to have a round of applause. And also, they're not here, but everyone from the Hub and Cafe who have organised the food and fed you over the last couple of days. I don't think anyone has gone hungry. And I'll portray that to the cafe staff and the management out there, so that's great. All I can say is, the last piece of housekeeping, lunch is now served. At 1:15, if you want to go for a walk around the place, meet back in here, and we'll take you out, and Lance or Lisa will take you out and discuss further options that we're working on out here. Any questions or anything? And all I will say is safe travels home.